Good afternoon. This is knowledge time. Welcome, alchemists. Today I'll be reading from the book The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Currently, I am in chapter 15. Make them want to follow you. The law of fickleness. Although styles of leadership change with the times, one constant remains. People are always ambivalent about those in power. They want to be led but also to feel free. They want to be protected and enjoy prosperity without making sacrifices. They both worship the king and want to kill him. When you are the leader of a group, people are continually prepared to turn on you the moment you seem weak or experience a setback. Do not succumb to the prejudice of the times, imagining that what you need to do to gain their loyalty is to seem to be their equal or their friend. People will doubt your strength, become suspicious of your motives, and respond with hidden contempt. Authority is the delicate art of creating the appearance of power, legitimacy, and fairness while getting people to identify with you as a leader who is in their service. If you want to lead, you must master the art from early on in life. Once you have gained people's trust, they will stand by you as their leader, no matter the bad circumstances. Part 1. The Entitlement Curse. On the morning of Saturday, January 14th, 1559, English people of all ages and classes began gathering in the streets of London. It was the day before the coronation of their new ruler, the 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor, to be known as Queen Elizabeth I. By tradition, the new monarch always led a ceremonial procession through the city. For most, it would be the first time they had ever seen Elizabeth. Some in the crowds were anxious. England was in bad financial shape. The government heavily in debt. Beggars were everywhere in the streets of large cities, and thieves roamed the countryside. Worst of all, the country had just been through a virtual civil war between Catholics and Protestants. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, from 1491 to 1547, had created the Church of England and had moved to transfer England into a Protestant country. The daughter from Henry's first marriage became Queen Mary I in 1553, and she tried to return England to the Catholic fold, initiating a kind of England Inquisition and earning the nickname Bloody Mary. After Mary's death in the late 1558, Elizabeth was next in line to succeed her. But was this the time for England to be ruled by a woman who was so young and inexperienced? Others were cautiously hopeful. Like the majority of the English, Elizabeth was a solid Protestant and would return the country to the Church of England. But optimistic or pessimistic, no one on either side really knew much about her. After Henry VIII, after Henry XIII had Elizabeth's mother and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, executed on trumpeted trumpeted up charges when Elizabeth was not yet there. Elizabeth had been shunted from stepmother to stepmother, and her presence within the court had been minimal. The English people knew that her children had been difficult and that Queen Mary had detested her, even throwing Elizabeth into the Tower of London in 1554. She had wanted to have Elizabeth executed on charges of conspiring against the crown but could not gather enough evidence. How had these experiences affected the young Elizabeth? Was she as impetuous as her father or as arrogant as her half-sister Mary? With so much at stake, they were beyond curious to know more about her. For the English, the procession was a day for celebration and merriment, and Elizabeth did not disappoint on that score. It was quite a spectacle. Colorful tapestries on the exterior walls of houses, banners, and streamers from every window, musicians and jesters roaming the streets entertaining the crowd. As a light snow fell, the queen to be herself now appeared on the streets, and wherever she passed, the crowd grew hushed. Carried in an open litter, she wore the most beautiful golden royal robe and the most magnificent jewels. She had a charming face and the liveliest dark eyes. But as the procession moved along and various pageants were performed for her benefit, the English saw something they had never witnessed before or could even begin to imagine. The Queen seemed to enjoy mingling with the crowds, tears filling her eyes as she listened attentively to the poorest of Londoners with their petitions and blessings for her reign. When she talked, her manner of speaking was natural and even a bit folksy. She fed off the growing excitement in the crowd, and her affection for the people in the streets was too apparent. One older and quite poor woman handed her a withered sprig of rosemary for good luck, and Elizabeth clutched it the entire day. One witness wrote to Elizabeth, "If ever any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of people, it was this queen. All her facilities were in motion, and every motion seemed a well-guided action. Her eye was set upon one, her ear listened to another, her judgment ran upon a third. To a fourth she addressed her speech. Her spirit seemed to be everywhere, and yet so entire in herself as it seemed to be nowhere else. Some she pitied, some she commended, some she thanked. At others she pleasantly and wittily jested, and distributing her smiles, looks, and graces, that thereupon the people again redoubled the testimony of their joys, and afterwards, raising everything to the highest strain, filled the ears of all men with immoderate extolling of their prince. The night the city of London was abuzz with stories of the day. In taverns and homes, people commented on Elizabeth's strange and electrifying presence. Kings and queens would often appear before the public, but they were surrounded with such pomp and eager to maintain their distance. They expected the people to obey and worship them, but Elizabeth seemed eager to win the people's love, and it had charmed everyone who had seen her that day. As word spread of this throughout the country, affection for their new queen began to swell among the English, and they entertained some hope for the new reign. Before the coronation, Elizabeth had made it known to Sir William Cecil that she would choose him as her most trusted minister. Cecil, 13 years older than the Queen, had served as an important counselor under Edward the 11th, Elizabeth's half-brother, who had ruled after the death of Henry the 13th in 1547 from age 9 until his death at age 15. Cecile had known Elizabeth since she was 14. They shared similar intellectual interests and were both solid Protestants. They had many lively conversations and a friendly rapport. For his part, Cecil understood her well. She was extremely intelligent, was very well read, and spoke many languages fluently. They would often play chess, and he was impressed with her patient style and how she often laid elaborate traps for his pieces. He knew that Elizabeth had been schooled in hardship. She had lost not only her mother when she was so young, but also her most beloved stepmother, Catherine Howard, when she was 8. Catherine was Henry's fifth wife and a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Henry had her beheaded on trumped-up charges of adultery. Cecile also knew that the few months Elizabeth had spent in the Tower of London, she had a traumatic effect on her since she had expected to be executed at any moment. She had emerged from all of these experiences as a remarkable, affable young woman, but Cecil knew that behind the exterior she was willful, temperamental, and even devious. Cecil was also certain about one more thing. Ruling was not for women. Queen Mary I had been England's first true female ruler, and she had proven to be a disaster. All the government ministers and administrators were men, and a woman could not stand up to the rough and tumble of dealing with them and with male foreign diplomats. Women are too emotional and unsteady. Elizabeth might have a very capable mind, but she did not have the resilience for the job. And so Cecil had formed a plan. Slowly, he and his cohorts would take over the reins, the queen advising but mostly following her minister's guidance. And as quickly as possible, they would get her married, preferably to a Protestant, and her husband would take over and rule it as the king. Almost from the beginning of her reign, however, Cecil realized that his plan would not be so easy to enact. The queen was headstrong and had plans of her own. In one way, he could not help but be impressed. Her first day on the job, she held a meeting and made it clear to her future counselors that she knew more than they did about the financial state of the country. She was determined to make the government solvent. She appointed Cecil as her Secretary of State, and she began meeting with him several times a day, giving him no spare hour to rest. Unlike her father, who had let his ministers run things so he could devote himself to hunting and pursuing young women, Elizabeth was completely hands-on. Cecile was astonished at how many hours she put into the job, working well past midnight. She was exacting in what she expected from him and the other ministers, and occasionally she could be quite intimidating. If he pleased her with what he said or did, the queen was all smiles and a touch of coquettish. But if something turned out wrong, or if he disagreed too vociferously, she would shut him out for days, and he would return home to stew in his anxiety. Had he lost her trust? On occasion, she looked at him harshly or even upbraided him in the thunderous style of her father. No, the queen would not be easy to manage, and slowly he found himself working harder than ever to impress her. As part of his plan for the men to slowly take over power, he made sure that all correspondence from foreign governments would be first routed to his desk. He would keep the queen in the dark on several important matters. Then he discovered that the queen had learned of this and behind his back had ordered all diplomatic correspondence to go through her. It was like a chess game, and she was playing several moves ahead. He got angry and accused her of undermining him in his work, but she stood her ground and had a very logical response, unlike Cecile. She spoke and read all of the major European languages and understood their nuisance, and it would be better for all if she personally conducted the diplomacy and brought the ministers up to date on foreign affairs. It was useless to argue, and he soon realized that when it came to handling such correspondence and meetings with diplomats, Elizabeth was a master negotiator. Slowly his resistance wore down. Elizabeth would remain in charge, at least for the first few years of her reign. But then she would marry and produce the necessary heir for England, and her husband would take over. It was unnatural for her to continue in this role as an unwed ruler. It was rumored that she had confided in several friends that she would never marry, and that she had an overwhelming fear of marriage based on what she had seen with her father. But Cecile could not take this seriously. She kept telling everyone that all that mattered was the greater good of England. But to keep England without an heir apparent was to risk a future civil war. Surely she could see the logic in this. His goal was simple: to get the Queen to agree to marry a foreign prince in order to forge an alliance that would benefit England in its weakened state. Preferably, this would be a Protestant prince, but as long as he was not a Catholic fanatic, Cecile would approve the choice. The French were dangling before her a marriage with their 14-year-old king, Charles the 11th, and the Habsburgs were promoting a marriage with Archduke Charles of Austria. Cecile's great fear was that she would marry the one man whom she had actually fallen in love with, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, a man beneath her in station who would stir up all kinds of dissension and intrigue within the English court. As representatives of different countries pressed their cases, Elizabeth would seem to favor one, then grow cold. If the Spanish were suddenly creating trouble on the continent, she would begin marriage negotiation with the French to make King Philip II of Spain suddenly fear a French-English alliance and back off, or with Archduke Charles of Austria to strike fear in both the French and Spanish. Year after year she played this game. She confessed to Cecile she had no desire to be a wife, but when Parliament threatened to cut off funds if she did not promise to marry, Elizabeth would soften and negotiate with one of her suitors. Then, once the funds from Parliament had been secured, she would find some other excuse to break off the marriage talks. Sounds familiar. The prince or king or archduke was too young, too fervently Catholic, not her type, too effeminate, on and on. Not even Dudley could break her resolve and get her to marry him. After a few years of this, his frustration mounting, Cecile finally saw through the game. There was nothing he could do. But at the same time, he had come to realize that Elizabeth I was almost certainly a more capable ruler than any of the foreign matches. She was so frugal with expenses that the government was no longer in debt. As Spain and France ruined themselves with endless wars, Elizabeth prudently kept England out of the conflicts, and soon the country was prospering. Although she was Protestant, she treated the English Catholics well, and the bitter feelings from the religious wars a decade before were now mostly gone. There was never so wise a woman born as Queen Elizabeth, he would later write, and so he eventually dropped the marriage issue, and the country itself slowly became used to the idea of the Virgin Queen, married to her subjects. Over the years, however, one issue would continue to eat away at the people's affection for the Queen, and even made Cecile begin to doubt her competence. The fate of Mary, Queen of Scots, cousin to Elizabeth. Mary was a staunch Catholic, while Scotland had become largely Protestant. Mary was next in line to be Queen of England, and many Catholics asserted that Mary was in fact the rightful queen. The Scots themselves came to despise Mary for her religious sentiments, for her adulterous affairs, and for her apparent implication in the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, in 1567. She was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in favor of her infant son, James VI. The following year, she escaped imprisonment in Scotland and fled to England, putting herself in the hands of her cousin. Elizabeth had every reason to despise Mary and return her to Scotland. She was the polar opposite of Elizabeth, selfish, flighty, and immoral. She was a fervent Catholic, and around her she would attract all those in England and abroad who wanted to depose Elizabeth and put a Catholic on the throne. She could not be trusted, but to the dismay of Cecile, her counselors, and the English people, Elizabeth allowed Mary to stay in the country under a mild form of house arrest. Politically, this seemed to make no sense. It infuriated the Scots and threatened relations between the two countries. As Mary began to secretly conspire against Elizabeth, and calls arose from all sides to have her executed for treason, inexplicably, Elizabeth refused to take what appeared to be the rational step. Was it simply a case of one Tudor protecting another? Did she fear the precedent of executing a queen, and what it might mean for her own fate? In any event, it made her look weak and selfish, as if what mattered were protecting a fellow queen. Then, in 1586, Mary became involved with the most audacious plot to have Elizabeth murdered, upon which Mary would have become Queen of England. She had secret backing from the Pope and the Spanish, and there was now in control incontrovertible proof of her involvement in the plot. This outraged the public, who could well imagine the bloody civil war that would have ensued if the plot had gone forward. This time, the pressure on Elizabeth was too great. No matter if Mary had been a queen, she had to be executed. But yet again, Elizabeth hesitated. A trial convicted Mary, but Elizabeth could not bring herself to sign the death warrant. To Cecile and those in the court who saw her daily, the queen had never appeared so distraught. Finally, in February of the next year, she caved to the pressure and signed the death warrant. Mary was beheaded the next day. The country erupted in celebration. Cecile and his fellow ministers breathed a sigh of relief. There would be no more conspiracies against Elizabeth, which would make the lack of her heir easier to bear. Despite her apparent mishandling of the situation, the English people quickly forgave her. She had proven that she could put the welfare of the country over personal considerations, and her reluctance only made the final decision seem all the more heroic. King Philip II of Spain had known Elizabeth for many years, having been married to her half-sister, Queen Mary I. When Mary had imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower of London, Philip had managed to soften her stance and get Elizabeth released. He found the young Elizabeth quite charming, and he had admired her intelligence, but over the years he began to dread and despise her. She was the main obstacle of his goal of reestablishing the dominance of Catholicism, and he would have to humble her. In his mind, she was not the legitimate Queen of England. He began sneaking Jesuit priests into England to spread the Catholic faith and secretly foment rebellion. He built up his navy and stealthily prepared for what was known as the Enterprise of England, a massive invasion that would overwhelm the island and restore it to Catholicism. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the final straw. It was time for the invasion. Philip felt supremely confident in the success of the enterprise. Over the years, he had taken the measure of his great rival. She was crafty and clever, but she had one overwhelming disadvantage. She was a woman. As such, she was unsuited to lead a war. In fact, she seemed to be afraid of armed conflict, always negotiating and finding ways to avoid it. She had never paid much attention to her military. The English navy was relatively small, its ships not nearly as large and powerful as the great Spanish galleons. England's army was quite pitiful compared with Spain's, and Philip had the gold from the New World to help finance the effort. He planned for the invasion to take place in the summer of 1587. But that year, Sir Francis Drake raided the Spanish coast and destroyed many of its ships in the harbor of Cadiz, while seizing great treasures of gold. Philip postponed the invasion of the following year, the cost slowly mounting for maintaining his army and building more galleons. Philip had overseen every detail of the invasion. He would He would launch an invincible armada of some 130 ships manned by over 30,000 men. It would easily destroy the English navy, link up with a large Spanish force in the Netherlands, cross the Channel, and sweep their way to London, where they would capture the Queen and put her on trial for the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. He would then put his own daughter on the throne of England. Finally, the Armada was launched in May of 1588, and by July, the Spanish fleet was maneuvering around the southwestern coast of England. The Spanish galleons had perfected a certain form of warfare. They were so large they would maneuver close to the enemy ships, grapple, and board them with a virtual army. But they had never done battle with the much smaller and faster English ships with their long-range cannons, and in waters much rougher than the Mediterranean. They did not do well. On July 27th, the Armada anchored at Calais, just a few miles from where the Spanish army awaited them. In the middle of the night, the English sent 5 unmanned fire ships loaded with flaming wood and pitch toward the anchored galleons. With the high winds that evening, the fire spread quickly from ship to ship. The Spanish galleons tried to regroup further out to sea, but their formation was loose and scattered, and the fast English ships fired at them like ducks in the water. As the winds changed again, the Spanish were forced to retreat northward into the stormiest parts of the North Sea, trying to round England and retreat to Spain. They lost most of their ships, and over 20,000 Spanish soldiers died. The English had lost no ships and had only around 100 casualties. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. For Philip, it was the most humiliating moment in his life. He retired into his palace, where he holed himself up for months, contemplating the disaster. The Armada had left Spain utterly bankrupt, and in the years to come, England would prosper while Spain became the second-rate power. Somehow Elizabeth had outwitted him. To the other leaders in Europe who hated her, she now seemed invincible and a ruler to be feared. Pope Sixtus V, who had excommunicated her and had given his blessings to the Armada, now exclaimed, "Just look how well she governs. She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, by all." Now, in England, there arose a veritable cult around the Virgin Queen. She was now referred to as Her Sacred Majesty. To catch a glimpse of her riding through London or passing on her barge on the Thames seemed like a religious experience. One group, however, proved less accessible to this powerful aura. The new generation of young men now filling the royal court. To them, the Queen was showing her age. They respected her accomplishments, but they saw her more as a domineering mother figure. England was a rising power. These young men yearned to make a name for themselves on the battlefield and so earn public acclaim. Yet Elizabeth continually thwarted this desire. She refused to finance a large-scale campaign to finish off Philip, or to aid the French in their fight against the Spanish. They saw her as tired and felt it was time for their spirited, masculine generation to lead England. And the young man who came to epitomize this new spirit was Robert de Verix, 2nd Earl of Essex. Born in 1566, Essex was handsome and high-strung. He knew the Queen had a weakness for young men, and he quickly charmed her, becoming her new favorite. He genuinely liked and admired her, but at the same time he resented the power she possessed over his faith. He began to test her. He asked for favors, mostly money. She gave these to him. She seemed to enjoy spoiling him, and as the relationship progressed, Essex began to see her as a woman he could manipulate. He started to criticize her rather boldly in front of other courtiers, and the queen let him get away with it. She drew a line, however, when he asked for a high political position for himself and his friends, and then he would fly into a rage. It was humiliating to depend on the whims of a woman, but days later he would calm down and return to his charm offensive. Kept away from political power, he saw that his only chance for fame and glory was to lead an English army to victory. Elizabeth allowed him to lead some smaller military expeditions on the continent. His record was mixed. He was brave but not very good at strategy. Then, in 1596, he persuaded her to let him lead a Drake-like raid on the Spanish coast. This time, his boldness paid off, and the campaign was a success. To the English people, now somewhat drunk on their new status as a European power, Essex represented their new swagger, and he became their darling. Essex wanted more of this and kept asking the queen for another chance in battle. He attributed her reluctance to the many enemies he had made in the court, men who envied him. In 1598, news reached the court that a band of Irish rebels under Hugh O'Neill, 2nd Earl of Tyrone, was moving through English-controlled territory in Ireland and wreaking havoc. Now Essex offered his services to lead a force to crush Tyrone. He pleaded and persisted, and Elizabeth finally relented. Feeling confident of his powers over the queen, he requested for the campaign the largest army yet assembled by the English. Elizabeth granted his wish. For the first time, he felt truly appreciated by her. She did have a strange ability to make him want to please her. He expressed his gratitude and promised to finish the job quickly. Ireland would be the means for him to rise to the top. Once he was there, however, the troubles mounted. It was the winter of 1599. The weather was awful and the terrain hopelessly boggy. He could not advance his enormous force. The Irish were elusive and masters at guerrilla warfare. While the English remained hobbled in their camps, thousands of soldiers died from disease, and just as many began to desert. Essex could only imagine his enemies at court talking behind his back. He felt certain the queen and several ministers were somehow plotting his downfall. He had to test her again. He asked for reinforcements. The queen agreed, but she ordered him to finally find and fight Tyrone. Suddenly, the pressure was too much, and he blamed the queen and her envious courtiers for trying to rush him. He felt humiliated by the position he was in, and by the end of the summer, he had decided upon a plan that would put an end once and for all to his misery. He would secretly negotiate a truce with Tyrone, then return to England and march on London with his troops. He would force the queen to get rid of his enemies within the court and secure his position as her lead counselor. He would be forceful but respectful of her position. Seeing him in person and with his troops, the queen would certainly relent. After a swift march through England, he suddenly showed up one morning in her bedchamber, his uniform caked in mud. The queen, caught by surprise and not knowing if he had come to arrest her and launch a coup, retain her composure. She offered him her hand to kiss and hold him, and told him that they would talk of Ireland later that day. Her calmness discomfited him. It was not what he had expected. She possessed a strange kind of power over him. Somehow the tables had been turned, and now he agreed to postpone their talk to the afternoon. Within hours, he found himself taken by her soldiers and placed under house arrest. Counting on his influence over the queen and how often she had forgiven him, he wrote her letter after letter. wrote her letter after letter, apologizing for his actions. She did not respond. This had never happened before, and it frightened him. Finally, in August of 16,000, she freed him. Grateful for this and plotting his comeback, he asked just one favor: to restore to him the monopoly he had possessed over the sale of sweet wines in England. He was hopelessly in debt, and this was his principal source of income. Much of his chagrin, she refused to honor his request. She was playing some game, trying to teach him a lesson or tame him. But that would never happen. She had pushed him too far. He retired to his house in London and gathered around him all of the disgruntled noblemen in England. Together, he would lead them on a march to the Queen's residence and take over the country. He predicted that thousands of Englishmen who still adored him would rally to his cause and swell the ranks of his troops. In early February 1601, he finally put his plan into action. To his utter dismay, Londoners stayed in their houses and ignored him. Sensing the foolhardiness of the venture, his fellow soldiers quickly deserted. Virtually alone, he retreated to his house. He knew this was the end for him, but at least he would remain defiant. That afternoon, soldiers came to arrest Essex. Elizabeth arranged for a quick trial, and Essex was found guilty of treason. This time, Elizabeth did not hesitate to sign the death warrant. During his trial, Essex maintained the most insolent air. He would go to his death, denying his guilt and refusing to ask forgiveness. The night before he was to be beheaded, the Queen sent her own chaplain to prepare him for the end. Confronted with this representative of Elizabeth, who delayed her last words to him, Essex broke down. All those moments in which he had sensed her authority but had tried to resist its power, including that morning in her bedchamber when she stood up before him so regal and self-possessed, suddenly overwhelmed him. He confessed his crimes to the chaplain. In his mind, he mixed the image of his imminent judgment before God with the majesty of the Queen, and he felt the full weight of his betrayal. He could see her face before him, and it frightened him. Whew. He told the chaplain, "I must confess to you that I am the greatest, the vilest, and most unthankful traitor that ever has been in the land. The Queen was right to execute him," he said. He requested a private execution so as not to inflame the public. In his last words, he asked God to preserve the Queen. He went to his death with a submissiveness and quiet dignity that no one had seen or suspected in him before. Interpretation. Wow. When Elizabeth Tudor became queen, she understood her supremely fragile position. Unlike her father or almost any other English monarch, she had zero credibility as a ruler and no respect or authority to draw upon. The country was in a weakened state. She was too young, with no political experience or prior proximity to power to learn from. Yes, by merely occupying the throne, she could expect some obedience, but such loyalty was thin and could change with the slightest mistake or crisis. And within months or years, she would be forced to marry. And as she knew, being married could lead to all sorts of problems if she did not quickly produce a male heir. What made this even more troubling was that Elizabeth was ambitious and highly intelligent. She felt more capable of ruling England. She had a vision of how she could solve its many problems and transform it into a European power. Marriage would not only be bad for her, but for the country as well. Most likely she would have to marry a foreign prince, whose allegiance would be to his country of origin. He would use England as a pawn in the continent's power games and drain its resources even further. But given all the odds against her, how could she hope to rule England on her own? She decided the only way forward was to turn her weak position into an advantage, forging her own type of credibility and authority, one that in the end would give her powers far greater than any previous king. Her plan was based on the following logic. Kings and queens of her time ruled with a tremendous sense of entitlement due to their bloodline and semi-divine status. They expected complete obedience and loyalty. They did not have to do anything to earn this. It came with the position. But this sense of entitlement had its consequences. Their subjects would pay homage, but the emotional connection to such rulers was in most cases not very deep. The English people could feel the distance separating themselves from the monarchs and how little their rulers really considered them. This feeling of entitlement also blunted their political effectiveness. The government ministers were cowed and intimidated by someone like Henry VIII, and so their energy went into appeasing the king rather than using their own intelligence and creative powers. With this sense of entitlement, rulers paid less attention to the details of governing, which were too boring. Wars of conquest became their chief means of getting glory and providing riches for the aristocrat, aristocracy. Even though she, even though such wars drained a country's resources, these rulers could be incredibly selfish. Henry VIII had Elizabeth's mother executed so he could marry his latest mistress, not caring how tyrannical this made him seem to the English. Mary, Queen of Scots, had her husband murdered so she could marry her lover. It would be easy for Elizabeth to delude herself and simply expect the loyalty that came with her august position. But she was too smart to fall into that trap. She would deliberately go in the opposite direction. She would feel no sense of entitlement. She would keep in mind the weakness of her actual position. She would not passively expect loyalty. She would turn active. She would earn the trust and credibility she required through her actions over time. She would demonstrate that she was not selfish, that everything she did was motivated by what was for the greater good of the country. She would be alert and relentless in the task. She would alter the way people, her subjects, her ministers, her foreign rivals perceived her, from an inexperienced and weak woman to a figure of authority and great power. By forging much deeper ties with her ministers and the commoners, she would overcome people's natural fickleness and channel their energies for the purpose of rebuilding England. Her first appearances before the English people were cleverly crafted to set the stage for a new type of leadership. Surrounded by all the unusual royal pomps, she mixed in a common touch, making her seem both comforting and regal. She was not faking this. Having felt powerless in her youth, she could identify with the poorest charwoman of England. She indicated through her attitude that she was on their side, sensitive to their opinions of her. She wanted to earn their approval. She would build on this empathy throughout her reign, and the bonds between her and subjects became much more intense than with any previous ruler. With her ministers, the task was delicate and difficult. It was a group of powerful, power-hungry men with their egos and need to feel smarter than and superior to a woman. She depended she depended on their help and goodwill to run the country. But if she revealed too much dependence on them, they would walk all over her. And so from the first days of her rule, she made the following clear. She was all business. She would work harder than all of them. She would reduce expenditures for the court, sacrificing her own income in the process, and all activity was to be directed toward lifting England out of the hole it had fallen into. Wow. She had showed early on her superior knowledge of the finances of the country and the tough side of herself in any negotiation. Upon occasion, she would flash her anger in a minister if a minister seemed to be furthering a personal agenda, as such outbursts could be quite intimidating. Mostly, though, she was warm and empathetic, attuned to the various moods of these men. Soon they wanted to please her and win her approval. To not work hard or smart enough could mean isolation and some coldness, and unconsciously they wanted to avoid this. They respected the fact that she lived up to her own high standards. In this way, she slowly placed these ministers into the same position that she had found herself in, needing to gain her trust and respect through their actions. Now, instead of a cabal of conspiring selfish ministers, the Queen had a team working to further her agenda, and the results soon spoke for themselves. By these methods, Elizabeth acquired the credibility she needed, but she made one major mistake: her handling of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth had become somewhat entitled herself, feeling in this case that she knew better than her ministers and that her personal qualms about executing a fellow queen trumped everything else. She paid a price for this policy as she felt the people's respect for her draining away, and it pained her. Her sense of the greater good was what guided her. But in this case, the greater good would be served by having Mary executed. She was violating her own principles. It took some time, but she realized her mistake. She tasked the head of her secret service to lure Mary into her most far-fetched conspiracy to get rid of Elizabeth. Now, with solid evidence of Mary's complicity, Elizabeth could take the dreaded step in the game, going against her own feelings for the sake of the country. In essence, admitting her mistake gained her even more trust from the English. It was the kind of response to public opinion that almost no rulers of the time were capable of. When it came to her foreign rivals, particularly Philip II, Elizabeth was not naive and understood the situation. Nothing she had done had earned her any respect or respite from her endless conspiracies to get rid of her. They disrespected her as an unmarried queen and as a woman who seemed to fear conflict and warfare. She largely ignored all of this and kept to her mission of securing England's finances. But when the invasion of England seemed imminent, she knew it was time to finally prove herself as the great strategist that she was. She would play on Philip's underestimating of her craftiness and her toughness as a leader. If war was necessary, she would do it as economically and efficiently as possible. She invested large sums in creating the most elaborate spy systems in Europe, which allowed her to know in advance Spain's plans for the invasion, including the date of the launch. With such knowledge, she could commission and pay for an army at the last minute, saving huge sums of money. She financed Sir Francis Drake's raids on the coast of Spain and its galleons at sea. This allowed her to enrich England's coffers and delay the launching of the Armada, which made it all the more expensive for Philip. Wow. When it seemed certain the launch would occur within a few months, she quickly built up the English Navy, commissioning smaller and faster ships, cheaper to build in bulk and well suited to the English seas. Unlike Philip, she left battle strategy in the hands of her admirals, but she overruled them on one score. She wanted them to fight the Armada as close to England as possible. This would play into English hands, as the Spanish galleons were not suited for the stormy northern seas, and the English soldiers, fighting with their backs to their country, would fight all the harder. In the end, Spain was bankrupted and never to return to her former glory, while England under Elizabeth was now the rising power. But after this great victory, she resisted the calls to take the battle to Spain and deal the country a final fatal blow. She was not interested in war for glory or conquest, but only to safeguard the country's interests. After the defeat of the Armada, her authority and credibility seemed invulnerable. But Elizabeth would never let her guard down. She knew that with age and success would naturally come that dreaded sense of entitlement and the insensitivity that went with it. Hmm. As a woman ruling the country by herself, she could not afford such a letdown. She retained her receptiveness to the moods of those around her, and she could sense that the younger men now filling the court had a much different attitude toward her. Their respect was for her position as queen, but it did not run much deeper than that. Once again, she would have to struggle against masculine egos, but this time without her own youthful charms and poetry to fall back on. Her goal with Essex was to tame and channel his spirit for the good of the country, as she had done with her ministers. She indulged him in the endless desires for money and perks, trying to calm his insecurities, but when it came to giving him any political power, she set limits. He had to prove himself to rise to her level before she would grant him such powers. When he threw tantrums, she remained calm and steady, unconsciously proving to him her superiority and the need for self control. When it became clear he could not be tamed, she let him go far enough with his conspiring to ruin his reputation and allow her to get rid of this cancer. And when he faced death for his crime, it was not simply the image of God that terrified him, but that of the queen, whose aura of authority finally overwhelmed this most insolent and self entitled of men. Understand. Wow. Although there are no longer powerful kings and queens in our midst, more of us than ever operate as if we consider ourselves royalty. We feel entitled to respect for our work, no matter how little we have actually accomplished. We feel people should take our ideas and projects seriously, no matter how little thought went into them or how meager our track record. We expect people to help us in our careers because we are sincere and have the best intentions. Some of this modern form of entitlement might come from being especially spoiled by our parents who made us feel that anything we did was golden. Some of it might come from the technology that so dominates our lives and spoils us as well. It gives us eminence powers without our having to exert any real effort. We have come to such powers for granted and expect everything in life to be so fast and easy. Whatever the cause, it infects all of us, and we must see this sense of entitlement as a curse. It makes us ignore the reality. People have no inherent reason to trust or respect us just because of who we are. It makes us lazy and contented with the slightest idea or the first draft of our work. Why do we have to raise our game or strain to improve ourselves when we feel we are already so great? It makes us insensitive and self-absorbed by feeling that others owe us trust and respect. We negate their willpower, their ability to judge for themselves, and this is infuriating. We may not see it, but we inspire resentment. And if we become leaders or sub-leaders, the effect of this curse only gets worse. Unconsciously, we tend to sit back and expect people to come to us with their loyalty and respect for the high position we occupy. We grow defensive and prickly in our ideas are challenged, putting our intelligence and wisdom into question. Even on the smallest of matters, we expect certain perks and privileges, and if there are sacrifices to be made, we somehow feel we should be exempted. If we make a mistake, it is always the fault of someone else or circumstances or some monetary inner demon beyond our control. We are never really to blame. We are not aware of how this affects those whom we lead because we notice only people's smiles and nods of approval at what we say, but but they see through us. They feel the entitlement we project. And over time, it diminishes their respect and disconnects them from our influence. At a certain tipping point, they may turn against us with a suddenness that is shocking. Like Elizabeth, we must realize that we are actually in a weak position and we must struggle to adapt the opposite attitude. We expect nothing from the people around us, from those whom we lead. We are not defensive or sitting back, but completely active. Everything we get from others, and most definitely their respect, must be earned. We have to continually prove ourselves. We have to show that our primary consideration is not ourselves and our sensitive egos, but the welfare of the group. We must be responsive and truly empathetic to people's moods, but with limits. To those who show themselves to be mostly self-promoting, we are tough and merciless. We practice what we preach, working harder than others, sacrificing our own interests if necessary, and being accountable for any mistakes. We expect the members of the group to follow our lead and prove themselves in return. With such an attitude, we will notice a very different effect. People will open themselves to our influence as we move toward them. They move toward us. They want to win our approval and respect. With such an emotional connection, we are more easily forgiven for mistakes. The group energy is not squandered on endless infighting and the clashing of egos, but is directed toward reaching goals and accomplishing great things. And in achieving such results, we can forge an aura of authority and power that only grows with time. What we say and do seems to carry extra weight, and our reputation precedes us. Quote, that is the road to the obedience of compulsion. But there is a shorter way to a nobler goal, the obedience of the will. When the interests of mankind are at stake, they will obey with joy the man whom they believe to be wiser than themselves. You may prove this on all sides. You may see how the sick man will beg the doctor to tell him what he ought to do, how a whole ship's company will listen to the pilot, Xenophon. Wow, I just have to say, wow, that was long. In conclusion, wow, that was a pretty, wow, that story about Queen Elizabeth pretty much inspired me. Pretty much just going against the norm. That's pretty much how she was so successful. Different strategies. She didn't give in to her ego or her desires. She just kept it humble, especially with the people. And I think that just kept her level-headed. One thing that caught my attention was the other kings and queens. They killed their husbands and wives for the mistress and a lover. Wow. And then later karma came and got them up, scooped them up. So, outro. Subscribe to the channel. Comment any questions you have. Like if the information was inspiring for you. And share this knowledge with other alchemists. Also, follow me on Instagram for more progressive knowledge. My Instagram is max_Bugatti_8008. I'm all about family first. I'm a global stock investor. I'm a filmmaker. I'm an aerospace botanist. And I have a masculine confidence building program. Currently, I'm out here in San Francisco, California. While you're slaying dragons, I'll be taming them.